Welcome to the Kyperian Commentary Podcast. This is episode 126. I'm talking today to Pastor Tim Decker. He's pastor of Trinity Reformed Baptist Church in near Roanoke, Virginia. He recently wrote a book called A Revolutionary Reading of Romans 13. And I wanted to have him on here because the book was inspired, I think, largely by COVID and things going on around COVID. So it's a good book, and I wanted to talk to him a little bit about it. So Tim, thanks for being on here with me.
It's good to have me on here. Thank you for having me on here. There, I think I'll get it
Right.
out.
I should also say this, Tim is currently my professor in a Bible class I'm taking, but this is not going to affect my grade in any way.
No, I don't expect it will.
Oh no, it's okay. Um, so so Tim, one thing I really have enjoyed about your book, just to kind of dive right in here, is that you structure the book in three parts: the world behind the text, the world within the text, and the world in front of the text. And I think that is unique in the treatments of Romans 13 that I've seen over the last few years. Could you just maybe very briefly sketch out what that means for the interpretation of a text, the behind, within, and in front of?
Well, as you say, to give a full-throated interpretation of Romans 13, I don't want to just look at it from a political theology standpoint or systematic theology. I wanted to take in historical backgrounds and not just extra biblical sources, but within the scriptures itself. What does the scriptures reveal to us about the world at the time when Paul would have been writing to the Romans in Romans 13? So that would be the world behind the text, just the thought world, what is happening in the Roman Empire, what's happening among the Jews, what's happening in the church at Rome, the Christians at Rome, what have they been dealing with? All of those things often get left out, not just with Romans 13, but just Romans in general. And
Right.
so I thought if we're going to do a full treatment on Romans 13, you got to start with that, because so often people come to Romans 13 as though it was just a theological treatise on justification. Then we move into the world into the text, which is treating the text, treating it exegetically. But even to get to chapter 13, you got to deal with chapters 1 through 12. And so the world within the text, we take up the themes of Romans and again try to dispel those notions that Romans is just a compendium of doctrine about justification. And I want to make the case within the text itself that it's Paul is addressing a pastoral concern that he has. Should he move his headquarters to Rome, that he might go out to Spain and evangelize, then he wants to make sure that those issues that have been brewing that we've talked about from the first part, the world behind the text, he's dispelled those. He's been able to treat the issues, the Jew-Gentile tension that is there. And then once you get to Romans 13, we exegete it with the world within the text. Then we have to do, after the analysis of those two worlds, we do the synthesis in the world in front of the text. How does this interpretation compare with what we see throughout the rest of Scripture? How does this jive with other parts of theology, like sphere sovereignty? I think we'll probably get into political theology, and that would be the world in front of the text. What are we to do with this now? What's the relevance? What's the application? What's the theological components to all these things? That would be the world in the text. And to do a full treatment, I think you have to do all three of those worlds to fully grasp a solid exegetical and theological foundation.
Right. And one thing I've seen over the last few years is there's been a lot of books published that are looking at the world in front of the text, you might say. It's been an attempt to really recover Christian political theory, 2,000 years of Christian political theory that, pastors haven't thought about for a while, it seems like. We haven't had to until a few years ago, right?
Yeah.
And suddenly it became a big issue again. But that's one thing I think is unique about your book, is that most of the books that have been published are looking at that post-biblical world and the development of those doctrines. And yours really starts from the ground level to re-examine the passage and look at it from a fresh perspective. So I do appreciate that.
Well, thank you for that. And it's not that those other books aren't needed.
Right.
I've even said, I think I even said in the book, probably someone more astute, more theologically minded should be writing part 3 of the book. But where I thrive would have been in parts 1 and 2. And so you're right. I think there is a dearth of material out there. In fact, the reason I started writing it down was because I wanted to see how that background material would affect our interpretation of Romans 13, and that just kind of spawned into I just need to keep expanding this because it was getting so long and so bloated. So I had to turn it from an article to multiple articles to this is going to be a book now. So I just need to expand it.
Right. And it was probably a lot more pressing a few years ago during COVID when you want to keep church open, you want to keep worshiping. People are saying, but Romans 13 says,
Yeah.
obey the magistrate. Um, have you found that you're still having a lot of those conversations with people today, that it's still a pretty live issue that you're dealing with as a pastor, maybe not even of your church, but in meeting other folks in the community, talking to people about these issues?
Maybe I'm just naive. It seems like things have calmed down enough, and this might be the subtle strategy of the enemy to get us back to an apathetic state
Hmm.
where round two is around the corner. We're not even ready for it. So I say that in saying, no, I haven't really felt any kind of pushback, but maybe in God's providence that this is being published around the time of election cycle, and we're seeing some tensions rise up again. I can see this topic becoming very salient again. Maybe I should back up. There are still some places in Canada, for example, where they're still under a lot of
Yeah.
scrutiny, a lot of tyranny, and so in that respect, I am in contact with some who they are dealing with a lot of these things. It's still a live issue for them, but for us here in America, um, yeah, because we weren't affected so much by political theology. It was just a topic that we let go. And not all segments of Protestants, but most Protestants just we were comfortable, we were apathetic, and we had a very simplistic understanding of Romans 13. So now that it's kind of being hashed out again and again and again from various perspectives and from various treatments, the danger is that we get apathetic once more, thinking, all right, we figured it out, now we can move on.
Yeah. And I would say what I always heard, what I heard in college, what I heard just generally, and what I probably would have told people before 2020 is that Romans 13 just teaches that you always obey the civil magistrate unless he directly commands you to disobey God.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's kind of the standard. Like, that's the only time you would ever have any sort of disobedience.
And that's the same approach I had, the very simplistic approach.
Right.
And there, I mean, obviously that's true, but that doesn't go far enough. Is that all Paul is saying in Romans 13? I tend to tell people now Romans 13 is more about the magistrate than it is about the citizen, because the title of the book is a revolutionary reading of Romans 13. Not that I'm inventing a new reading, a new interpretation. It's not novel. It's that what I think Paul is getting at in Romans 13 is he's prohibiting private revolution. He's prohibiting, the mostly peaceful protests that are happening in streets where, cars are lit on fire and government buildings are being attacked. He's prohibiting those types of things, and Christians, once he gets to verse 5, he's saying specifically Christians, you ought not to be doing those things. So because of that, he's putting guardrails around what citizens ought not to do, but especially verses 3 and 4 of Romans 13, he's specifically saying what government ought to do. And so often we just treat it as here's what Christians, the only time that Christians can, not submit to the government is, sin. And that's true, but is that really what Paul is getting at? And I don't think it is. I think he's getting at something more. And I think he ends, this is, I wish I would have spent more time on this in my book. Verse 7, I think, is a crucial passage, that honor is given to whom honor is due. What do you do when you have a government that is not honorable, not doing their job as it's outlined in verses 3 and 4? Then that's Paul, I think, his way of saying it's more than just when they tell you to sin. It's we don't do these things when they're being so despicable, so dishonorable. There's a point where it would be dishonorable for us to show honor to someone so dishonorable. And I think that's a principle in the Proverbs that we see. So that's probably something that needs to be teased out a bit more, I think.
And so one thing I liked, well, maybe I'll set you up and let you talk about it instead of it's your book. I'll let you talk about it. In Romans 13, you're talking about honor is given to whom honor is due. Paul says, obey the magistrate, but that magistrate he's talking about is Nero, who's a wicked man who's persecuting and killing Christians. So how can you say that we only honor those to whom honor is due if the very person Paul's talking about is Nero?
Yeah. Well, I'll show the book.
Hmm.
I did not choose the picture, but that is a bust of Nero. And I think you're setting me up very nicely because you've read this part where the first 5 years of Nero's reign, he starts reigning in AD 54. And so he'll reign from 54 until he is goes crazy seemingly in 59. But those first 5 years are said to be some of the best years of the Roman Empire. Many Roman historians and church historians, Christian church historians, have said that those first 5 years of Nero's reign were some of the best in uh, the Roman Empire. And that's the time, that's the setting that Paul is writing when he's writing to the Christians, not when Nero is persecuting and doing egregious things, wicked things. His depravity was unleashed. God certainly gave him over to his depravity. Um, but before then, he was restraining him, I think, and it was at that time when Paul addresses this issue, and that puts it in a more interesting context that Paul is saying submit, but there, the other side of the pendulum is, well, if Nero was a good emperor, then clearly what he's describing in verses 3 and 4 is descriptive. It's not prescriptive of how all magistrates should function, and I think that view is patently false as well. The very fact that he calls all magistrates, not just Nero, but all magistrates, uh, servants or ministers of God. The term is diakonos, where we get our
Yeah.
term deacon from, that they're an avenger. Even those terms imply that they have a function to do. It's prescribing how they ought to act. And even Nero wasn't perfect in that time, but again, he was widely praised in his first 5 years as some of the best years of the Roman Empire. It's not the story you often hear. We hear Nero, we
Right.
shudder. Now here's the interesting thing. By the time you get to Peter, when Peter is writing in 1 Peter 2 about being submissive to the governing authorities, again, now we do have Nero, and Nero has gone wicked. He's broke bad, but he's also Peter's not just saying Nero specifically. He's saying submit to the supreme magistrate. He doesn't say him by name, but he says the king. So he's referring to the office rather than the person. But then Peter specifically speaks of the inferior or the lesser magistrate. So even Peter is saying that there is a prescriptive role of the government to punish evildoers and to praise the good, to reward, incentivize the good. And so you see those same concepts, just Paul is writing in a different political climate, but they're still saying that we do submit to the magistrate so long as the magistrate, I think, is doing what he ought to be doing. But Paul's main issue in Romans 13 is no matter how you feel about Rome, whether good or bad, because a lot of the Jews, having been expelled from Rome, exiled, and now are allowed to return, there's not a lot of love lost on the Roman Empire. And so Paul is saying, if I'm going to set up shop here, I can't have this Jew Gentile issue a problem. So don't participate in private revolution, something that the Jews were very known for, very, very common for. We see this all throughout the New Testament. We see this in extra biblical literature that they were so accustomed to private revolution. And so Paul is saying, don't engage in that. There's a right way that government self-corrects. That's through what I would call public revolution. And so a lesser magistrate or even a superior magistrate doing interposing or bringing down upon a wicked tyrant, that's self-correction. I think that Paul's fine with that, I believe. I think you
Right.
see that all throughout the scriptures. But what Paul is saying in Romans 13, especially verse 2, you see it in verse 2 about resistance. That word means physical resistance, taking up arms as a private person, or even if it was a church, or a synagogue, we're going to take up our swords and attack. Well, that's not the role of a private citizen as a private citizen, or a synagogue or church as a in the sphere of the church. But if it's under the auspice and leadership of a magistrate, then you're no longer in private revolution. You're in what we might call a public revolution, which is what the American Revolution was all about back in the 1700s. It was
Right.
led by the Congress. It was led by our lesser magistrates.
And that ties into what Paul was just saying in chapter 12 too. Obviously Paul's writing a letter without chapter divisions, and he's just told his readers, don't avenge yourselves, but leave way to God's wrath, because God says, vengeance is mine, I will repay. And then right after that, Paul says, and by the way, the one who's going to execute God's wrath is the magistrate. That's who
Right.
God has given it over to. So yeah, I like that balance there. I like the delving into that, early Roman imperial history. Partly because guys like to think about the Roman Empire every day at least once, but also because that's kind of what I taught for years when I was teaching online high school. That was like the class I was plugged into, where they would read Tacitus and read Josephus. And so this book really brought that together for me with what Paul's saying in Romans in a way that I hadn't thought of before, but that really resonated. One thing I'd like to kind of pick your brain about a little bit here, and then we can maybe move on to your part 3 of your book, where you talk about our culture today. And I think this might connect as well, but you're talking about the role God has given the magistrate. And I think it's helpful for people to see that there's a difference between the role the man plays and the man himself.
Mm-hmm.
So, even, Nero was a good ruler before he burnt down his own city and blamed the Christians for it. Uh, Tiberius, who was the emperor at the time of Christ, was just an absolutely depraved and wicked man who did horrible things. And yet his victims were all within sort of the senatorial class, the people near him personally. The Roman Empire as a whole was being governed pretty justly during his lifetime. He was pretty good for the average Roman person. So do you see a distinction there between it's not a matter so much of if the ruler is personally righteous as much as if the ruler is executing his God-given role correctly? What would you say to that? I'm just wanting to pick your.
Well, yeah, I think I would lean on someone like Samuel Rutherford that makes this very clear that what we're submitting to is the office of the magistrate, not the man or, in some cases, woman, but not the man himself. And I think that carries over to our own modern context because we may not like the moral qualities of our magistrates. Some we might like even less. But as far as a magistrate, how are they performing that duty and that task? That's the main issue. And so when I've likened it this way: when the magistrate whose job is to punish evildoers, and that's why he has the sword, and he no longer does that. He allows violence to go unchecked. He's no longer protecting the welfare of citizens. Then at that point, he's no longer acting as a magistrate. He's acting as a thug. In the same way that the mafia would go around collecting protection money from businesses, call it a tax, and if you didn't pay that tax, they would not protect you. They would inflict punishment and harm upon you. At that point, if that's what the government is doing, they're not doing their job, then you don't submit to them because in essence, they're not even a true magistrate anymore. They've become a mafia, thugs and a mob. And so this is what I think Rutherford and others are saying, that they're no longer the magistrate. They're no longer fulfilling that office, and therefore you have no duty to submit to them. However, and as you were mentioning with Tiberius, and we could again our modern context. However you feel about Trump or Biden, Trump is not a godly man in my estimation.
Right.
But as a magistrate, I thought he did a lot of good things. He's one of those few politicians that kept his promises, which is how you know he's not a real politician, actually. Um, but whether you disagree with him as a man, the reality is, as a magistrate, he did what he claimed he would do. And so I would submit to him, not because he is a good, godly Christian. I don't think he is. I'm not convinced he's a Christian at all. But what I
Right.
am saying is that likewise with Biden, or likewise with Governor Newsom, if I was in California, whether they are godly or not, the question is, how are they functioning as a magistrate in that public office? They are a public person. And so because they're not we don't submit to them as a private person, we submit to them as a public person in public office. That's the measure of our level of submission in that role.
Right. So let me set us up here for kind of this is probably the big discussion today, and I'll admit I haven't got to the third part of your book yet. Hope to finish it soon. But uh, we have a lot of people talking about the need for a Christian government, Christian rulers, Christian magistrates, and things of that nature. Who, I mean, obviously, in the last 4 years, people really want to recover a Christian view of politics. Uh, and you've got various competing pictures of that. You've got theonomy, you've got Kuyperian sphere sovereignty, you've got classic two kingdom theology, radical modern, the modern iteration of two kingdom theology. You have Christian nationalism, which sort of wants to claim the mantle of the classic Reformed two kingdoms view, and here you are talking about submission to the magistrate, what the duties of a magistrate are. Do you want to place yourself somewhere on that spectrum or just kind of give your thoughts? We have 10 minutes, so it's not enough time for a big discussion, but I know your church is also doing a conference coming up soon
We
about
are.
this
Well,
very
let me
topic.
give
So I'd be interested in
yeah, I'll
your
give a plug for that at least. We're having Dr. Tom Hicks come. He's one of the pastors at First Baptist Church of I think Clinton, Louisiana. He's a professor at CBTS and IRBS, I believe. And we're having him come to do our men's conference in April. I want to say April 5th to the 7th, on a biblical critique of theonomy and Christian nationalism. And those terms are so loaded because it really depends on who you're talking to, what they mean. And I think I know where you are, Rick. And so we know what we mean by those terms, I think, but I don't know that everyone does. And in fact, I'm not a fan of the term Christian nationalism only because it was a moniker given by opponents, progressives, and
right.
so it was meant to have a negative connotation with it. So I'm leery about taking on that. I'd rather invent my own moniker if I could.
Mhm.
Um, so where I fall on that, well, I'm not a theonomist. Theonomy meaning God's law, in that I don't. I make a division between the threefold distinction of God's law: the moral, the ceremonial, and the civil, of the Old Testament law. And I believe in the perpetuity of the moral law, whether before the Ten Commandments, after the Ten Commandments, before the cross, after the cross. I think the Ten Commandments, all 10 commandments, are binding on
Mhm.
everybody. But when it comes to the magistrate's role of the moral law of God, what's interesting is that when you get to Romans 13 also deals with God's moral law. The Ten Commandments are brought up later in chapter 13. But so how does a magistrate know how to praise the good and punish the evildoer? Well, he has the moral law of God, and there is a component where the church, as especially the minister of a local church, is a public person of the church, has I think a responsibility to prophetically call out what is right and good, although
Yeah.
natural law is within the heart of these individuals as well. But what you do see in Romans 13 is only the second table of the law. So you see commandments 5 through 10 mentioned there, really 5 through 9. And I think that is indicative of Paul identifying that the role of the magistrate is to operate off of those commandments. So whether it be murder, we would all agree that the magistrate has a duty to punish those murderers, those evildoers. Likewise, I think the magistrate has a role of of coming down criminally, in some way, maybe not criminally, but in some way, by way of punishing those who would, participate in no fault divorce or even adultery. I think there needs to be consequences to those, legal consequences to those, because that's part of the moral law of God. When it comes to the first table of the law, this is where the Christian nationalism debate, the theonomy debate comes in. What is the role of the magistrate in terms of blasphemy laws or Sabbatarian laws? And I would take the approach. I'm not of the persuasion that the magistrate, it's the sphere of the magistrate to enforce the first table. But I
Mhm.
would say that I think the magistrate has every right to incentivize keeping the first table. What does that look like? Well, just like the magistrate incentivizes with tax credits those who have children. And so there is a tax benefit for having more children. Maybe not a great example, but at least it's an example of how they've incentivized something that's good and right.
Yeah.
Could they incentivize businesses who close on the Lord's Day, saying you were honoring God, Chick-fil-A, by making your Sabbatarian chicken and making it on all the days but Sunday. So we'll give you tax breaks or tax credits. Would other businesses be inclined to do that? I think so. So I would take the view, I don't know what you call this, but I would take the view that the government ought to be dictating its laws based on the moral law of God, and that the way they gauge what is right and wrong is the moral law, the Ten Commandments, specifically the second table. But it's the first table that's the questionable part of how should they enforce the first table. That's where we might have some disagreement with some.
Right. So the question then isn't should the public square, should the government be a secular, religiously neutral venue?
Not
You're
at all.
assuming that they ought to submit to the Lord. Your question is, how far does their authority extend to
Well,
enforce those particular laws?
yes, and a couple things. Secular neutrality is a religion. I think we need to stop talking about it as if it's a religious. That has become it's I would call it the state religion of our day, to be quite
Right.
honest. But even in a secular society, I think natural law teaches us, because before you had the Ten Commandments, those Ten Commandments were still in operation. The moral law of God was still in operation, that the works of the law are written in the conscience of man. And so whether you live in a quote unquote Christian nation or not, there are very, very few societies, and they're not flourishing, that think that it's okay to commit adultery, that it's okay to steal, that it's okay to murder. Pretty much every society that has some form of magistrate understands that to operate properly, because we live in God's world, whether they want to confess God or not, they have to submit to God's laws. And so I think that there is a component that natural law plays here. But given the fact, and I think this is a part of the discussion that gets left out, given the fact that we have the heritage that we do, the reason that we have the jurisprudence that we have is because of our Christian heritage, our Protestant heritage. And so it's you can't approach America, or the 50 states, in the same way that you might approach it in another part of the world that doesn't have our heritage, because we are what we are because of our Protestant upbringing. And so I want to say that we should be able to lean more on explicitly religious Christian nation type of
Mhm.
rhetoric, because we were at one time a Christian nation, until Barack Obama's in Turkey said we're not a Christian nation, and everyone looks up and says, "What? I thought we were." It says, "In God we trust" on our coins. And so I think there is a distinction there, that other places in the world, though they're going to operate under natural law, they can't be as explicitly Christian because they don't have that same heritage. The
Mhm.
reason that they're in a different place in their society and their politics is because they didn't have the Protestant work ethic and the Protestant jurisprudence informing them. This is why I have no problem calling the Pope the Antichrist, because you look at Latin American countries that are dominated by the Roman Catholic Church, there's a reason why they're third world. And
Mm.
so to refer to them as Christian nation and needing to get back to a Christian nation, well, they for them, they have a quote unquote Christian nationalism, but it's not the Protestant biblical one I'd like it to be. So yeah, the nomenclature can be tricky depending
Yeah.
on the context. I'm rambling.
Well,
I'm sorry.
even that idea of, you say we want a Christian nation, we are a Christian nation. I would like every nation to be a Christian nation in the world. That's the goal of the Great Commission, is everyone converts, and then you have that sort of thing.
Well,
But I
yeah,
think what
I
happens a
agree.
lot of
I would
times,
love to see the gospel dominate the
right,
world, so much so that
right.
every society has become Christianized. I don't see that happening in the Bible, and I know where you are, where we line up, but that's okay. I love my post millennial brothers. You're not too far from the kingdom. Bah,
Yeah.
just kidding.
But the distinction there is, I think, you can say that, and without, going into all the details, I mean, because we only have a few minutes left, but uh, a lot of people would say, saying you want a Christian nation, that's Christian nationalism. And I think, it's good to, I mean, I'm happy for people to call me a Christian nationalist if they want to. I would not call myself that necessarily, because I have some pretty big differences, I think, with that movement. But you're right; it is a lot about the terminology, like what's the label, and I saw an article from some secular magazine calling John Piper a Christian nationalist. I was like,
Yeah.
well, I guess
Yeah.
we're all Christian nationalists now
Yeah.
then, right?
That's when the term has no meaning.
Exactly.
Is it just here's the thing, is it distinctly Christian to want to outlaw theft?
Hmm.
It's not. It's not distinctly Christian. It's distinctly
Right.
moral.
Hmm.
And so that's why I don't
Yeah.
need the title. And would I want a nation to be Christianized? Okay, maybe. But do I want a nation, a magistrate, a political entity to govern itself based on God's law, whether they espouse Christ or not? That's what I prefer because I believe that's the role of the
Right.
magistrate to maintain justice in society.
Yeah. So, have you seen, and this was just Friday, have you seen the decision of the Supreme Court of Alabama? Because
Yeah,
that's
I
really
think I
relevant
remember
here.
reading something on it, but maybe you can enlighten a little bit more details.
Well, they heard a case about whether embryos created through in vitro fertilization have full protection under the law as human beings, and they ruled yes, they do, which means that that could be a huge blow for IVF in Alabama.
Well, and didn't the judge, if I read it correctly, invoked the God of the Bible and appealed to it? And this is where I'm talking about. We have that history, and
Right.
even in our jurisprudence, way back when, that we can do that without it being, awkward and strange. And in a country that may not have that history, it might seem strange and almost seditious for one judge in a entirely Hindu country who is converted to Christianity speak of the God of the Bible, a holy God of consuming fire. Whereas here, that should be vanilla. That
Right.
should be very commonplace. And because we've bowed down to the state religion of neutrality and secularism, then that feels so subversive when it's really not. If you read through the law books, the judges' rulings, but yes, that is a very wonderful ruling, and we'll see how that has effects down the road. Hopefully, it will have tremendous effects, but I think that that was a positive. That was a very good thing.
Yeah, exciting times. Well, thanks for being here, Tim. We're about out of time, but it was good talking to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Rick.
And for those of you who are watching or listening, you can buy Tim's book, A Revolutionary Reading of Romans 13. You can buy it on Amazon in Kindle format right now. The hardcover was supposed to be available, but there was a printer error, so the hardcover is going to be available at the end of March. And I will put a link to the Founders Ministry page where you'll be able to order that hardcover, and I'll also put a link to the Kindle edition down in the description so that you can go read his book if you'd like to. All right, thanks for being here, Tim.
You, Rick.